Professor Bhadro, you can
sir.
start now.
Okay,
we are live on YouTube. You can start, Bula ma'am. Shomdatta,
Yes, I'm there.
where is Bula ma'am?
Let me call her.
No, she's here. No, she's rejoining.
Okay, fine. The moment it is unmounted, the video is gone. Should I start now?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm starting then. Oh God. What is happening? Okay. There are about 84.
Bula ma'am, please start. We can't hear you.
Good afternoon, everybody in India, and good morning to Bandana, where it is 7:30 a.m. Welcome, Bandana. You have to get up very early for us. Thank you. Let me say a few words to about the need for having lectures by internationally acclaimed sociologists. Ours is a very, very new university, only roughly 2 years old, and our department is also very new, only about 2 years, a few months old. So we actually thought in the department that it would be nice to hear internationally acclaimed sociologists for future directions, for doing a different kind of research,
If everyone can mute their microphone, everyone else mute their microphone, please.
So for updating us and for giving us guidance, it will be very nice for our students, scholars, for everybody, even for our faculty, which is a very young new faculty except myself. So this is the reason actually we thought of this. Now bringing international scholars are very difficult for any Indian university because it costs a lot in terms of unequal exchange rate. So we decided that we should bring our internationally acclaimed sociologist through international webinars. We looked at COVID from a different point of view on this issue that COVID has given opportunity to listen to quite internationally famous scholars through webinars, which does not cost us as it used to cost us in past to bring international scholars. So this is the only positive side of COVID we can look at. Now, other thing is that we have some thirst areas in our curriculum. So we decided in the department that we should start with the first of them, which is Sociology of Gender and Sexuality. This course is taught in undergraduate, postgraduate, and a research emphasis on there in terms of doing new research of applying different kinds of methodologies like MITS method and do more ethnographic stuff originally. So this is the reason actually we started to have this one. Now, why bring Professor Bandana Purokaisto as the first, lecture? Because Bandana has both the world's best of it. She is born and brought up in Calcutta, studied at Presidency College, and then went to USA, did her higher studies. So Vandana can bring us both the lens and both the reality in a realistic manner. And that has been the simple decision and rationale for us to bring Vandana Purokaistu to begin with. I will give a little bit detail after Vice Chancellor talks, and I will now give a little bit of introduction about our Vice Chancellor first and then the other two guests. Because I know that there are from lot of universities in India, people have joined. So I would like to know that they should know our Vice Chancellor also. Professor Dr. Dhruvajyoti Chattopadhyay is currently the Honorable Vice Chancellor of our sister Nivedita University, which he joined from January 2020, about 6 months later than I joined. Professor Chattopadhyay was the Dean of Science in the University of Calcutta from 2003 to 2007. By the way, we have been working together in Calcutta University for a good 25 years. That is the reason I think he also needs to be known to everybody else. So he was the founder VC of Amity University at Calcutta from 2015 to 2019. He was the Pro Vice Chancellor Academic of the University, Calcutta that is, from 2008 till 2015. He was also the Director at the Center for Research in Nanoscience and Nanotechnology at the University of Calcutta from 2007 till 2015, when he went to become VC of Amity and the founder VC. Professor Chattopadhyay, as I understand, as a VC and a very good friend, that I cannot actually finish his achievements probably 2-3 hours more than this webinar. So I will just say he started getting awards.
It's okay, right now, Professor Bhadro. We can start because all of us are eagerly waiting to hear Vandana Purokaistu.
Yes, let me do the introductory part.
You have done it. You have done it. We are very close friends. That's it. And so right now,
let me just tell two more sentences about my dear Vice Chancellor and my friend, dear friend. He is a recipient from 1892, a long list of awards. I'm not going to go it. He's actually saying no. But he received prestigious award from UNESCO, which allowed him to do research in the Department of Biochemistry at the University of Texas. He also visited lot of places, but he will get mad at me, so I am not saying that. He is a very, humble person and a soft-spoken person, not like me. Okay, now Professor Vandana Purokaistu. Well, he's a professor of sociology and Asian American studies.
Gula ma'am, I think VC sir would be giving a formal welcome address.
Yeah, VC will. Just after this, VC sir will give.
Yes,
Let me introduce Vandana while VC.
Vandana, yes.
That is what I said. Professor Vandana Purokaistu of Sociology and Asian and American Studies of the University of Connecticut. She's a joint professor. Prolific scholar, research on human rights, intersectionality, gender, transnationalism, migrants, violence, peace, etc. appears in over 75 books and articles, and she has won, about lots of awards. I will only mention 3 to all of us. American Sociological Association coveted J.C. Barnard Award from 2019. 2018 Sociologist for Women's Society, SWS, very known to gender scholars, for Feminist Mentoring Award. So that's a special one for us. And 2016 American Sociological Association's contribution to the Field Award, and also for one of the best book award. Now this actually makes Vandana quite an international one, in terms of she has been also a postdoctoral candidate in terms of the at JNU in I think 2016 or so. So in a sense, Vandana also currently serves in the International Sociological Association 16-member elected executive committees, which is the highest professional association in the subject, and also catering 120 countries. Now, Vandana, last word would be from myself. I found her dedicated sociologist, determined and always ready to protest against gender inequality and violation of rights. And I will just say 2 more lines about another special guest of honor among us, Professor Ranjan Thakur, the founding Vice Chancellor of SNU and currently our mentor at SNU. He was founding VC of both State University of West Bengal and Techno India, famous biophysicist, molecular biologist, my colleague for a 20-year period, and a superb human being for motivating and encouraging all of us. Often I find him completely removed from gender bias. One person I've seen in the whole world that he is not gender biased while talking to us. So here is the forum for our Vice Chancellor, my very good friend, Professor Dr. Dhrubajyoti Chattopadhyay. Please, sir.
Good evening and good morning. Now, today we just had a very interesting Teachers' Day program by the students, and there I found that normally, as both Bula and myself, Professor Bhadra and myself, we are colleagues for a long period of time, along with Professor Thakur. We understand that it is very important right now to do a lot of unlearning of what we have learned so far. And that is why I found that today's seminar is going to be very, very important, because as I came to know from Professor Bhadra that it's in the internationally acclaimed sociologist Vandana Purakayastha is one of the person who really looked at things from a completely different point of view. Let me first pay my respect to Professor Ashok Ranjan Thakur, and also welcome Professor Vandana Purakayastha and already the 115 participants who joined us in this Zoom meeting, along with number of people who joined us in our test in the YouTube program. Now, this Professor Bhadra already mentioned about why in the Department of Sociology is trying to have this series of lectures by international acclaimed sociologists. This is to give an exposure to the students, the researchers, as well as the faculty members also. And in Sister Nivedita University, we are very much interested to actually have the interdisciplinary studies to get quite a bit of expansion in that. And thereby, when we talk about this interdisciplinary, we actually want to mention that cross-discipline people should actually interact with each other. Now, the subject of today's topic, gender, is actually, I found that it is absolutely interdisciplinary, and each area, each domain has got its own way of expressing that what they feel about it. But we are eagerly waiting to hear from Professor Purakayastha regarding her views, as well as the number of things which are going on in the recent past in this particular area. Particularly, you know that this the Afghanistan issue opened up a huge number of these gender issues and the challenges. Everyone is reacting in different ways. Thank you, Professor Purakayastha, for accepting our request. Thank you, all the participants over here. And I must congratulate the departmental faculty members also who are with us today and eagerly waiting for your lecture, Professor Purakayastha. Namaskar. Thank you. Hello. Hello.
Shall I just go ahead and start?
I think
I suggest you start.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You have to unmute.
Thank you. Well, I begin by saying thank you, Dhanyabad, to Vice Chancellor Dhrubajyoti Chattopadhyay, because I know your time is very precious. Thank you for being here, and thank you for that generous introduction as well. And of course, I accepted this offer to give this talk because I have known Dr. Bula Bhodro and several other people who've joined. I'm mesmerized when people have been saying hi to me. But a lot of the people who've joined here today are people who I met through a series of global encounters, if you will, through the International Sociological Association, where I spend a lot of time listening to a lot of erudite presentations and keep changing the way I think about subjects. But more about that later. Now, today, of course, the topic of my talk, and I'll just put up a PowerPoint. I'm not actually using a PowerPoint per se, but just to guide me and keep me to the time. But the topic of my talk is Analyzing Gender, Global Encounters. And since this talk was initially supposed to be about students, what I plan to do is I'm going to target the students for the first part of my talk. Many of the people who are in the audience today are very well versed in gender. In fact, I learned from some of you, and you know who I'm talking about. For all those who are in that position, think about this as a journey. So I'm going to start at the beginning. Y'all are well ahead. You'll just have to wait for us, me and the students, till we catch up with you. And from that point onwards, when I catch up with you, there'll be a conversation. Now, let me begin at the simplest level. That is, there is still surprisingly an ongoing idea amongst the general population, as well as in political rhetoric, that gender is simply another word about women. And of course, that is not the way we think about gender, especially as sociologists. It's simply not an adequate equivalence, as I will unravel as we go along. But to get ahead of myself, when we think about gender, we really think about at least three dynamics that work together. That is the ideologies, how we think about gender per se, the interactions between people that hold certain boundaries, that restrict the access to power for certain groups of people, whereas other people hold on to enormous amounts of power, and the institutional arrangements that continue to mark the inequalities and foster the inequalities, frankly, that keep men and women, and of course, men, women, and transgendered humans in unequal power positions in society. In other words, we produce and facilitate this inequality, and some people find more and more opportunities to build lives that they would like, while denying others the opportunity to build lives of human dignity. So with that as an introduction, I wish to say that analyzing gender is about analyzing these structures that maintain power inequalities and constantly reinvent its own structures to keep inequality very much present in our societies. Now, I want to stop here for a couple of minutes and say that anything that I'm talking about is simply based on centuries, and I do mean centuries, of feminist scholarship. Now, I know feminism is a term that has been debated and thought over, and there are debates about, is it Western, is it local, and a whole series of things like that. Those are matters of discussion elsewhere. But I do wish to say that any knowledge that we have about gender has been developed through the scholarship and activism of people across countries. And by people here, I mean an overwhelming number of them are women. I also, at this point, wish to share my screen so I can make one important point. Okay, so the point that I wish to make here is that when we talk about gender, it's not just about talk. Especially as social scientists, we go through a rigorous process of peer review, and we are constantly challenging ourselves to find out the adequacy of the models through which we think about analyzing the world. And I'm forced to say this because we are in a day and age where quick Google searches and WhatsApp snippets are sometimes accepted as adequate substitutes for scholarly knowledge. And so it's not a pleasure, but I feel obligated, especially for the students, to emphasize that there is a long scholarly stream that's rigorous, and it's about gender, and that's where most of my talk will come from. Now, I'm going to take, I'm just going to segue a little in and hopefully show you a snippet of a movie. Actually, it's a movie based on a novel by Ranjan Thakur called Ghore Baire. Not the whole thing, it's a snippet of about 3 minutes, because I'm going to use that to talk a little further about gender. And if it does not work, then of course I'm going to, I have some still photographs from that movie. And the reason why I chose this snippet from Ghore Baire is really twofold. I do want to talk about this issue of who do we turn to when we're trying to understand. In my case, I would talk about the sociologies of gender. Like, who do we see as some of the people who actually thought about it, not accept their ideas in a static way, but accept the nuggets of ideas so that we can move on. That subject about knowledge construction and knowledge hierarchy will come up later. But I'm going to show you this snippet because I just like it. I actually also teach this in class, so it was easy for me to do it. Let me try, and if it doesn't work, as I said, I do have stills from this. So if you would give me a second, there is a point to this.
আমার বড় যাকে আমি এসে অবধি থান করেই দেখেছি। এদের থেকে বোঝা না গেলেও আমি জানতাম আমার যা বিবাহিত জীবনে কোনো সুখ পায়নি। আমাদের দুজনের স্থান ছিল রাজবাড়ির অন্তঃপুরে। অন্দর আর বাইরের মধ্যে ছিল রঙিন শাঁসি দিয়ে ঘেরা বারান্দা। এই বারান্দার দরজা আমাদের জন্য বন্ধই থাকতো। তাতে আমার কোনো ছেদ ছিল না, কারণ আমার মনটা ছিল সাবেক সুরে বাঁধা। আমার স্বামী কিন্তু ছিলেন এ যুগের মানুষ। এ বংশে তিনি প্রথম লেখাপড়া শিখে MA পাশ করেন। তার সব মেটাতে মিস এলবি এলেন আমাকে মেম সাহেব বানাতে।
Okay, so to go back to the point that I wanted to make, and I will share the stills again, is simply this, that this snippet shows a whole range of women. You see Bimola, you see her sister-in-law, And you see these three women who are never really named either in the story or in the movie. And so this is a question that I want to start with. When we talk about women, even when we are talking about women as we discuss gender, which of these people are we talking about? Because clearly Bimola belongs to a particular class, particular caste even, definitely a particular religion. Her sister-in-law is not really in exactly the same location as she is. And these women who just by virtue of their embodied language are not exactly the same as her. So gender, to begin with, is about intersectionalities, thinking about the intersections of caste and class and religion, gender, of course, region, and a whole series of other issues that force us to think beyond these simplistic ideas that gender is about women and that's all we need to know about it. If our ideology is about women, it has to do with we honor all of our women, then clearly we are not in the process of honoring these other women in quite the same way as, we would be talking about when we talk from our, and highlight our ideologies about honoring. Now, if we move on to the next slide, somehow there is something wrong with this, so I shall stop sharing. And I see also that there is some attempt to scroll across the slide, so I can certainly do a presentation without that.
Do you want me to?
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'll just go on. We can ignore whatever those scrolls were.
You can stop.
No, we don't need to stop.
Annotation. There's a button called annotating.
Okay. So let me go back. So the point I was trying to make is when we talk about analyzing gender, there is a central reason why we go beyond women and we begin to think about men, women, and transgender people by thinking about their class, caste, religion, national, and all of these other locations, because it's those structures that actually lead to constellations of power that particular human beings can have access to and that other people don't have access to. Now I'm going to veer off a little and, I'm not going to use the PowerPoints anymore, but I sent it to Professor Bhadra. So, for the students in the audience, you can ask her for the PowerPoints later. But as Professor Bhadra said that, I spent amazingly now less than half of my life in Kolkata. So I went to Prep Memorial School, I went to Presidency College, and I was a geographer. So I actually came late to this idea of gender, and it only happened when I joined sociology at the University of Connecticut. And one of the people that I can see on my screen right now, I don't know if other people can see her, is Duckman, who happens to be one of the people, one of the women who pushed herself and their group pushed their way into American Sociological Association's business meeting and demanded that women be accepted as full partners within the sociological enterprise. So this idea of gender and how we study it is also based on this longer scaffolding, if you will, taking on the challenges of breaking the boundaries to enable us to think about women and men and transgender people in certain ways. In my own thinking, Myra Marks Ferry's Beyond Separate Spheres, which was published in 1990, was one of the key articles that really got me thinking about gender. And in that, Myra Ferry questioned this idea that sociologists had to talk about families as single units. This was an article published in a family studies journal, and she said that when we keep talking about families and talking about families and talking about families, we are actually erasing what happens within families. Secondly, at the same time, Robert Connell, as Connell was known then, published a critique of sex roles theory and how scholars keep talking about gender socialization as the only thing that creates the separation between men and women. And Connell argued that this approach of thinking about gender only in terms of socialization has two major flaws. One, it's ahistoric, simply because how we socialize people, young people, and how we get socialized ourselves change with our larger circumstances. So if we just keep talking about socialization within families, we're not actually doing a good enough job as scholars if we also don't ask which families and what are they socializing their children to do. Because recall the woman who was combing out Bimala's hair. If I assume that she was somebody who worked in Bimala's house, surely she did not have really the freedom or the power to bring her daughter up the way, or even her son up, the way in which somebody from the middle class assumes what the world will be for their children. So socialization varies. The second issue is that if we just talk about gender in terms of socialization, we are actually forgetting all of the other institutions that shape our lives. I mean, all of us, especially those of us who are no longer students, know the many places in which we experience these inequalities. Workplaces, pay inequity continues. I don't know the statistics about India. You would know more about it. But at the least, one of the things I do know is if you look at the informal sector in India, women are consistently paid less than men for the same jobs. It's probably true of white collar occupations, but as I said, I'm not touching that because I don't have data on it. But also this inequality between men and women and transgendered human beings resides at the level of the state. The laws, and more importantly, how it is applied, how it is policed, and what and whose power are upheld become very important and central to this question of gender as well. So if we don't have substantive rights, it's not enough to have the rights simply written in the Constitution, but if we are not able to access it, if our lives are being restricted, then that's an inequality that the state fosters and facilitates. And of course, a variety of other institutional arrangements. I know right now with the transgender bills having passed very recently in India, there is some move, and actually in Kolkata, there are some healthcare clinics that are more well designed, and I just say more, not fully, more well designed to offer healthcare to transgender people. Now, we've always known about transgendered people, but that institutional arrangement, that can they get healthcare, and especially think about COVID and every thing, every kind of challenge that it's throwing up in our lives. Simple things like that. Can you get access to healthcare, which is a function of institutional arrangement, is going to contribute to the same idea of gender. So these are some of my early roots. I'm going back to Connell, I'm going back to Myra Marks Ferry, and obviously this is in the US. My learning from the Indian scholars actually came later. But there's one other article by Connell that I want to mention that I have been thinking about a lot lately. And that is, I believe it was in the late 1980s, Connell published an article called Live Free and Die Young. And it was an ethnography based on 5 young Australian men. They were working class men. And in it, Connell described how these young men tried to get the status as men that they felt they deserved. But because they were working class and some of them were unemployed, there weren't too many institutional ways in which they could grasp that power that they felt entitled to. And one of the things that they did a lot of, and maybe this will, ring a bell with you as well, they drove around the streets in motorbikes, making a lot of noise to announce their presence. So this idea of gender, to kind of summarize that early part of it, was already questioning ideas that we seem to be teaching about how the differences between men and women arise, how, we basically talk about families and then we don't look at historic settings, how we are ready to accept these static ideas that once you've been socialized in a certain way, that's where you stay, as though your life doesn't expand. So obviously gender scholarship was questioning those issues and questioning them very, very seriously. Now, Cornell, many of you might know because of her work as Raven Cornell later on, once she started publishing Southern Theories. I'll come back to Southern Theories later on, but I did want to alert you to Cornell's earlier work. For me, from the 1990s, another revolution that happened in sociology was the kind of wave that came with Black feminist scholars. Patricia Hill Collins's Black feminist thought brought the question of race centrally to the question of gender. It brought, more importantly, questions about epistemologies. It brought into focus questions of who should know and how should we know it. And of course, waves of Asian American and Latinx scholars. This would mean everybody from Evelyn McConnell Glenn, Mary Romero, and right now, another quiet revolution is in progress as we listen to the indigenous, that is the Native American scholars. And right now, my top favorite is Leanne Simpson, who I will talk about again. So to summarize that part of the American scholarship, since I want to actually get to the issue of global encounters, is that the challenges to thinking about gender started with this idea of how do we think about women. It soon expanded to a questioning of men and women in terms of power, institutional arrangements, and interactions. And very soon, at least in terms of my life as a sociologist, by the 1990s, centrally brought in the question of race and racism structures, and of course, the structures of sexuality. I'm not going into the details of that because those are the kinds of readings that you can get access to. But there is a wealth of scholars in India from whom I have learned a great deal. And scholars who are in Chennai, Delhi, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Mumbai, Pune, and one or two of you, I'll be quoting you later on in the talk, but I wanted to acknowledge the work that you do because it has certainly influenced me to think about this concept intersectionality, which I understood in terms of race, class, gender differently once I started thinking that how on earth could we take theories and frameworks that definitely apply very well to certain countries and then try and think about these theories as part of a larger world. That, of course, is part of our current challenge. Now, there is one issue that I want to raise before I move on to global encounters, which is where I want to spend some time. And that is that there is a wealth of work, oral, written, that already exists and are now gaining a little more visibility by marginalized scholars in India. Certainly, there's a wealth of work by Dalit scholars, or people who have been steeped in the politics of the marginalized. Gail Umved, who died recently, and there's been a lot of eulogies of her work, including today morning. I saw Kalpana Kannabiran's writing on Gail Umved. People like Gail Umved, and whether it's Gail Umved or S. Anandi or people writing about tribal populations, there is a wealth of work that brings the situation of the marginalized to this question of gender. Some of it, of course, has come through literature. Mahashita Devi's Dobdi, which I believe is now in a kind of controversy because it's been banned from from being taught in certain institutions. Those kinds of thinking and thought processes remain very relevant to my thinking because it pushes me to think beyond my comfort zone. And that, I think, is, in a nutshell, is where I can segue into the issue of analyzing gender, global perspectives or global encounters, if you will, because part of the global encounters is about encountering knowledge. We could all sit in our homes and not venture out into the world and look to see what other people are writing. And when I say world here, I don't always mean international. I also mean outside the worlds of what we are most familiar with, venturing beyond that, thinking about what are other people saying, being willing to be uncomfortable with those ideas instead of holding on to positions that are no longer supportable through research. And so the analysis of gender through one level of global encounters really is referring to that aspect. Okay, so now if we move on much more to the global encounters part, I'm going back to the issue of what we saw with Bimola and Miss Gilby. Clearly, all of you who are listening from India know that that is a colonial encounter. For those who are listening from the US, it may not be as familiar to you, but basically this whole idea that the British had justified, one of their major justifications of why they were in all of these colonies looting resources, was covered up with the ideology of, oh, we're here to protect the women. And part of that churning, what also happened is there was a churning within society, and there were these attempts in many parts of India, and I will share a personal aspect of that in a minute, but there was a churning in many parts of India about what kind of education should we get. And Miss Gilby represents the somewhat impoverished, unmarried, which was a status that was not highly regarded either by the British or by the Indians. Here is a woman who comes to India and one of her jobs is to act as governess. And right there, what we find, if you are familiar with the movie, is she's teaching Bimola to speak in English. She's teaching Bimola English songs. And she asked Bimola to perform, as her husband also asked, Bimola to perform how well she can pour tea. That was supposed to represent modernization, as the modernization ideas were thought about in that stage of the world history. It was Victorian England. It brought a huge amount of new restrictions to the roles of women, and that global encounter with colonialism that introduced these different forms, but ideologically built up forms of modernization and called it emancipation of women, actually has left very long traces amongst many of us still today. Bimola, apart from this singing this English song, playing it on the piano and, talking English and writing her journal and pouring tea, in the next scene actually talks about how Miss Gilby's influence extended to her clothes. And that I want to flag as another global encounter, because how people would dress and what that would indicate brings in this whole churning of what was adequate in terms of women's bodies, women's movements, women's presence in public spaces. These become issues. Of course, all of you in India then know that some of the movements that were already started in Bengal, and I do wish to emphasize this, about buying locally, being self-sufficient and so on, then was given an all India character by Gandhi through the Khadi movement. That, again, there is a political statement to be made by what we wear. I wanted to flag this issue of consumption and attire because over the last 2 weeks, I've been reading about this controversy, and now I'm jumping forward to, right now, and this is just a flag for the students. I've been reading about this controversy with the designer Shobhoshachi. So Shobhoshachi signs this, I suppose, this grand contract with some outlets in England, and what he is going to showcase are these wonderful designs and patterns and weaves from India. And of course, it's become a sign of cosmopolitanism in the 1/3 world or the global north to show what you're wearing and how much it is inflected with these weaves and designs and colors and jewelry and all, and even the men's clothing and so on, that reflects other parts of the world. So in other words, you can be modern cosmopolitan today just based on what you are consuming. That controversy, of course, I want to tag onto what we were seeing in Home and the World. Those women who were sitting in the corner are the ones who are with the one woman who was tying Bimola's hair. How much are they central to this? We are going to be modern, emancipated, powerful women just by virtue of what we are wearing and consuming. Are they able to do it? Are they not able to do it? And more importantly, in Shobhoshachi's case, a constellation of weavers from India have written an open letter to him saying, where are we? We are the ones who weave it. It's our design, our creativity, our work, our labor. Where are we acknowledged in this generalized idea of Indian design shaping the world of global design? So an encounter that I tagged in Home and the World, this idea of being a modern woman based on what we are wearing, is actually an issue that remains very salient for all of us today. And I put myself into that same category of, am I trying to divert my attention on the power inequalities by sometimes simply saying that because I'm open to the world, therefore I am your ally, or therefore I get it. I get the pain of the people who are protesting Shobhoshachi's actions and so on and so forth. So global encounters that shape our thinking about gender, the first point that I want to make is it should never lose sight of this questioning mind and question our own social locations and how much our doing of gender is based on exploitation and erasure of other people's labor, thinking, and knowledge. Are we simply taking it and claiming it as our own? And if we are doing that, we are actually fostering and contributing to the kind of inequalities that I was talking about when I talked about gender. So There is another aspect of colonialism that, I wish to foster. And again, all of you who've read Ray or have watched Satyajit Roy's documentary of Home and the World, you have a slight sense of what I mean. But I wish to point out that this encounter with colonialism, through which gender was being reformed in India, as shown in that movie, has a lot of resonance around the world today. Because in order to keep power, the British did several things. First, in order to keep their control, they took on the task of classifying people, that you're this and not that. And how you decide you're this and not that, sometimes it was based on blood. In the US, for example, for the longest time, if you had one drop of supposedly non-white blood, you were considered to be non-white. I can get into that in a question and answer session later, but right now you'll have to take my word for it. Centuries of social movements in the US have protested that, and at least for African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans in the US, that is no longer the criteria, but it is a criteria for Native Americans. It has not gone away. So who has the power to classify that you're this and not that becomes a major issue. I'll give you another example close to home. Yesterday, I went to the wedding of a friend who's from Nepal, and they belong to the Newar community. And as she always reminds me, the Newar community are both Buddhist and Hindus. Now, on that, if you impose a line saying you're this or that, and especially on all of the communities in India and elsewhere, where you're forced to choose one or another, whoever's doing the classifying has power. Also, the power to rewrite histories, power to erase, power to acknowledge who are the makers of their own destiny. All of these are part of the power that we began to think about more centrally through these encounter with the British in India. I know that is what happened within my family. And I'm going to illustrate the point I made by giving you a little bit of biography here. So both my parents' families came from Bangladesh. They moved during the partition. My husband and I, and actually most of our generation, were all born in India. But this is a story of, this taking the power and making it into something else that is really central to understanding these dimensions of gender. My maternal grandfather, Dadu, for all of you who understand that Bengali term, my Dadu was actually very modest circumstances. He supported not only his own family of 3 daughters, 2 sons, and his wife, but also his younger brother's family. I believe his younger brother died early, and he worked in the British Postal Service. But as the independence movement started and grew, my oldest mama, that is my mother's older brother, jumped headlong into the independence movement first. And when he jumped into the independence movement, he was engaged in activities that the British soon labeled as terrorist. And my grandfather was punished, literally in these terms, for failure to control his terrorist son by being demoted one time after another, till when my mother was about in the 8th grade, and they used to live in a large city, so they all went to school. They were demoted to a village where not only was there no school for girls, that was unheard of, but there was really no school for the boys. And my grandparents, and at this point, I'm trying to provide this reminder that they had very little money. But the one thing they decided was they were not going to succumb to British power and just stop educating their children. So my mother, the next younger brother, and the youngest sister had a teacher who came once a day in the evening And they were expected to somehow learn and sit for the qualifying exams, the high school exams, and go on to college. The oldest brother could not ever come home because there were always police waiting to catch him, right? And when my mother actually graduated high school, again, sitting as a private candidate, I believe people came from 10, 15 villages around to see this wonder, a girl pass school. It was unheard of where they were. My mother went on to doing many things. And while most of the men of the family served in prison, she was never actually sent to prison for her activities and speeches against the British. But they had a long list of, all of her infractions, because when she went to get a passport in modern day India, there was a police, there's usually, you have to get clearance from the police. And the police laughed, but they did mention that, we have pages of questions about your suspicious activities. Anyway, the point is that here was a very modest economic circumstances family grasping power and saying, we will not give in. We will not give in to the circumstances, and we are going to try and make something out of whatever it is that, has been given to us. And I'm not saying this story because I want to push the idea that anybody can flourish if they just put their minds to it. That I think is rubbish. But what I want to definitely emphasize is when independent India was born, people like my mother and my aunt, my mamimas, or my uncles' wives and so on, this was a whole generation of women who already were ready to take on the task of working in the places that would build modern day India. So there was a certain amount of power grasp, a certain amount of shifting of gender relationships. And certainly in our family, there was never any question, not in my family, not in my husband's family, about should women work, should they get higher education, should they be allowed to go anywhere. These were not questions because it had already gotten sorted out through family socialization, a point that I made earlier. But in this case, the family socialization changed in tune with whatever was going on before. So, enough of that story. The point I want to make is that the traces of some of these global encounters lasted very, very, very long time. And it's worth our while to pay attention to the traces of those interactions and changing institutional circumstances and who the architects are beyond the leaders to try and understand how power shifts and changes. Let me turn to the second last issue that I want to mention today. And one of the issues that I do want to mention is about violence. The scholarship on gender has a very strong stream of research on violence. Some of it is violence against women within families, but a lot of it is, especially from the scholars who are typically marginalized by, upper classes, upper castes, white races, and so on. There is a lot of scholarship about violence against the entire group. And to sum this up, I'm going to read Professor Kalpana Kannagaran's introduction, and I know she is here, so I'm looking at you, Kalpana. And you wrote, there is an unspeakability of violence even while it is ubiquitous, an appearance of exceptionalism even while it might structure every day, a perception of it as a tool of the cruel oppressor, even while historic record is replete with the ordinariness of the perpetrator. Moreover, because violence talk presumes its extraordinariness, its aberrational essence, its oppositional location to civilization, scholarly writing and society and history focuses on just that. And she's right about it. However, I also, as she has done, want to point out in all of the ways in which gender scholars, some of them, have tried to write beyond this extraordinariness of violence and focus on its inequity, because that violence is what fundamentally keeps the inequalities between differently located men and women alive. And it certainly is the boundary between how we see men and women and transgendered human beings. So global encounters in terms of gender, Professor Chattopadhyay mentioned the Afghan refugees fleeing. Global encounters with gender have to take into account the wars, the colonialisms of the past, the imperialism of today, the military incursions, the conflicts fostered and generated to retain the might of some. All of these are part of our analysis of gender. It has to be. If it is not, then we are not doing adequate justice to how we analyze gender at any level, in any form. Now, in the PowerPoints, I mentioned the work of Yakin Ertürk, who was the special rapporteur on violence against women at the UN. She was the second special rapporteur, Turkish sociologist, and certainly my friend, I think a friend of some of you who are in the audience here. Yakin has written a lot about the struggles at the United Nations level to try and even get violence against women recognized. I want to flag that because gender...
Vandana, just for a moment, let me just interrupt you for a moment. Please, those who want to ask questions, please write in the chat box, because Professor Purokayastha is going to finish very soon now. So please write your question to the chat box. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was talking about Professor Yakin Ertürk, the Turkish sociologist, because by the time she spearheaded really the effort to bring violence against women as a human rights violation to the UN, there had been centuries of organizing by women's groups around the world to kind of strengthen her hand so she could act as a leader to break a boundary that actually the UN was formed in the 1950s. Violence against women does not come into play at the UN level till the 1990s and does not become a human rights violation till the 21st century. So I'm flagging that. On the one hand, I talked about what Professor Kannabiran has written and, more importantly, done repeatedly in her sphere of work, but I also wanted to flag this upper level at the international level where work is needed, not only in terms of scholarship, but in terms of lobbying and in terms of constant pressure to grasp the power to say, we need to think about people differently, we need to think about power, and only if we can do that, then these global encounters lead to a diminishing of the power that is inherent in global hierarchies. I'm going to actually end with kind of one idea and then tell you what I have not talked about. The idea I want to end with is most of us as scholars have been used to thinking of gender in terms of local regions, states, nations, and to a certain extent, at the international level and so on. I would strongly urge everyone, and now I'm talking to the scholars who are, part of participating in this panel, we need to very consistently start analyzing the virtual spheres. What are the institutions controlling it? Who has power? Who has the most strident voices and why? What are they saying? How are they drowning out and erasing the voices that looked like they were going to make a difference? Now, the virtual sphere also opens up some possibility for people who are marginalized and not allowed to speak within institutions to speak directly to a whole lot of people. I recognize that it's important for us to study it, but it's also important for us to study the forces and the institutions that are designed to erase and silence much of the efforts that are being made to dismantle gender. Now, I think I'm going to simply stop here today, but end with these words that as I talked about gender, I tried to give you a sense of a history of encounters locally and globally that keep changing how we think about the concept, how we study it as scholars, how we teach it, what are we going to teach, and more importantly, how we keep retraining our minds to think about, what's pertinent for us to understand gender. The part that I have not talked about today, which I hope to talk about the next day, is how is this knowledge created? What becomes institutional knowledge? What do we need for it? What are the hierarchies of it? And that is a whole nother subject that was too much for me to touch on today. We'll get back to it the next day. So I think I will end just there. The gender is about intersectionalities in whichever country, whichever region we are looking. That's number one. Number two, gender analysis can never be separated from a wider set of circumstances that continue to shape even local matters. And that's as true of the US as it is for India or for any other country that we want to talk about. And depending on the level at which we want to teach or we want to do our research, it is important to keep these global encounters historic and contemporary in mind as we think about the whole process of doing research and teaching of gender. Thank you.
Thank you, Vandana. I would not comment. I'll comment next day because I'll give the floor to the others, especially to our mentor and our first Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjan Thakur, who is here. And I would request Professor Thakur to, you have any question, anything you want to say? Because you have been associated with all of us who will, who are so-called feminists. So Vandana is also one. And do you want to have any interaction with Professor Purohit? Professor Thakur, please.
Sure. It's a great honor. It was an exquisite lecture. You took us down the road. As a first question for starting this university, which we are building on a STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, management, and arts. And we believe that the students should be introduced to all the branches equally so that they can make a proper choice. So, in that perspective, how would you put today's kind of lecture becoming relevant for the engineering and the natural science students? That's one part. I'll quickly finish off with two other points. You mentioned about race and actually showed us Ghore Baire. What I believe Ray, both in Ghore Baire and Nostoni's cinematic version, was restricting himself on an kind of zamindari, kind of family and the relationship and going out. However, what strikes me much more is in Charodhai, Ela's background is not very clearly stated, and she is definitely into the revolutionary movement. And Shomumitra actually made it an epic theatre production. And Otin's character, the gender issues related to such a thing, for me would be very interesting because this is one of the most controversial novel of Tagore, for which he had to write an explanatory note on why did he write. The third part that I would really like to sort of know from you and also for my students is, as we look at the global situation, in India there is a Kishan movement which has been going on for almost a year now. It is strongly led by the women. It has its impact on the society, just as the Afghan women who could come out during the non-Taliban period, but now have to go back. And lastly, even the Black Lives Matter movement has a gender issue because it involves individuals rather than segregating them by their sexual position. So these are the three broad areas. You need not answer all of them, but I was curious.
Vandana, do you want to answer, or let's see whether anybody else have any question? Because I don't see any question in the chat box.
I'm kind of eager to answer some of those, but if you find other questions, please just stop me and tell me.
Anybody have question, please quickly write. Are you overwhelmed by Professor Vandana Murukasto? Don't be. She's a very nice person and a very warm person. You can ask questions. Okay, is there, okay, let me read this question. I request everybody to write, brief. Good evening, ma'am. How to ensure that appropriation of subjective experience of people of certain nations and groups across gender doesn't happen while addressing feminism and ecology. For example, fashion and organic products, investing and thriving on this explanation. Did you get it, Vandana? Because it is, I know, this big question, sorry, it is from my doctoral scholar. But
so I will actually first take Professor Thakur's question, or at least one or two of them, and then go on to Ishani's question, and
then
I think Aniket's question. And if you just kind of maybe freeze it there, I'll come back and read it. So Professor Thakur, what I did want to say is you're absolutely right about the presence of women leading the movements. I'll take that first, whether it's a Kisan movement, whether it was some of the CAA movements in Delhi and so on and so forth, certainly Afghanistan. Part of what happens is the way the police functions of the state are set up, and this is where gender works, is it's far more set. I mean, women are not excluded from the violence, but men are subject to far more violence, much more quickly and easily, and often women step in. And you reminded me of a story. Again, I'm going to pick on my biography. My father belonged to a Brahmin Jamindar family. Now, this is, I know, a contradiction in terms, but this happened to have been true. He also, at a very young age, joined the independence movement and was first jailed for trying to protest the caste segregation of hostels in his college, Daulatpur College. Okay, so when they were protesting, and this I have heard is in histories later on, when they were protesting, the police were called in to beat up the students. And he said, what happened is we were protesting on campus and out on the streets, and our mashimas and kakimas and didimas ran out and they covered us with their bodies. And it still gives me, it makes me emotional to talk about it. But the picture I have is that the women who came to kind of protect them from the brutality of that time, which admittedly were just lathis, nonetheless got some of those blows themselves, right? At the same time, because it kind of looked bad that the British or the soldiers who were part of the British were beating up unarmed women, they had to stop at a point. So there is that moral question of how far will the state go in terms of using its repressive measures, states, countries, what have you. When countries bomb, they don't wait to see is it women and children we are bombing. We are bombing whoever, Afghans, right? That's US that I'm talking about. But there are some situations where women they feel they can intervene better, though I think that line is being worn out. So that's one question in answer to what you said. In terms of your engineering students, so my husband is an engineer and he went to IIT Kharagpur, where his class had 2 women and 298 men. But the issue is, and this is a conversation that he and I have all the time, that all of these men have grown into being in positions where decisions are made. Are they going to be knowledgeable enough where if sexual harassment is reported, they understand it, they don't have to understand it from scratch? If they are confronted, or are they willing to ask for data that looks for pay inequity, looks to see if there's cumulative disadvantage of women that they're having to work harder to make, the higher ranks or whatever that career is. They need to be trained to understand these things, because if they don't, they are going to contribute to building a nation where the nation's laws and policies are primarily about men and not about women at all. And I mean, I've written about this cumulative disadvantage before. Several other people who are in the audience have written about it, but I cannot emphasize sufficiently why it is absolutely critical that those students in engineering and all of the technical sciences need the social sciences, and they need to understand intersectionality, not simply gender, intersectionality. So gender, class, caste, religion, all of these factors working together. So I'm just going to answer those 2 questions for you. One of these days, COVID will be over. I'll be back in Kolkata. I usually go every year, but I haven't for a time. We'll sit over cups of tea and we'll have the rest of the conversation. I'll go back to Ishani Dev and the appropriation of subjective experience of people of certain nations and groups across gender. You're right, in terms of whether it's feminism and ecology, whether it's, we are all happy, again, go back to that question of consumption. We are all happy to consume organic products. We're all happy to lead simpler lifestyles. But what are the institutional arrangements through which we live it? So we still have people laboring, and their knowledge of forest products or plant products and other things that are going to get commercialized and sold as a brand, where organic is a brand, or how are we doing organic? I mean, in a way, it's important to think about. And I have to say, I can't live up to this. Like when my parents, embraced khadi, my father and mother actually got married in khadi. Which they wove themselves. They were so badly woven and they're so heavy. It's like wearing jute. But they did it because they kind of had this sense of practice and our ideas have to meet. Can I do that? Absolutely not. I'm with you. That, I'm many degrees removed from that kind of practice and commitment. However, it is our job not to facilitate the branding of organic as a commercial enterprise and our consumption of organic as the end point of us being non-exploitative in terms of the labor relations and the knowledge relations of the people whose knowledge and labor goes into the making of organic. So that's kind of my, again, short answer to you, Ishani. And again, this can be a conversation later. Aniket, you talked about tradition and modernity. And modernity has brought changes to gender relations, several forms of gender violence, of modernity on one aspect of gender violence, not vis-a-vis the state, on informal personal level. I'm not sure that modernity actually brought, somehow, modernity's forms of violence are definitely different. But did it bring in violence and somehow traditionally there was less violence? I absolutely do not believe that. I mean, in the US, I'm being a little facetious here, we burnt witches. We've had sati, we've had all kinds of things. We've had people die living deaths. Bimala's sister-in-law, in that family, her material needs were met, but there's a particular kind of, I'll call it violence, that restriction when you can't do anything for yourself. None of your desires are going to be met. You have to be in these narrow, restricted roles that will let you do nothing but be in the margins of those families. All of that was already there, and in some forms, in some places, it continues to persist. Where modernity's violence has become different is that the weapons of violence are different. So you can be violent, for example, by trolling people on Twitter and social media. Somebody says something, and then whole army of people start questioning, harassing, issuing threats. That's a modern form of violence. We did not have that kind of violence before, right? So I think the forms have differed, but the underlying issue remains the same, that how much of power do people still feel completely happy to just take over just so they can teach those women a lesson. If I can add one other quick example, if you'll indulge me, Professor Bhodro, I know that we are running out of time.
No, sure,
So
go ahead,
after partition, when my mother and Mamimas had started working, this was in Kolkata, they used to have a thing called ladies' tram. Now in Kolkata, all of you know about the trams. I know they're disappearing. In those days, ladies' trams. And my Mamima, who's now 95, told me the story that, she worked at the General Post Office and she knew she was getting paid very little compared to the Anglo-Indian women who were seen as more modern and smarter and able to do that job, and compared to men, whatever. But she said she made friends with Anglo-Indian women very quickly because they would get on that ladies' tram and the Anglo-Indian women would stand on the lower padani, the lower step of the tram, and any man who wanted to jump on, they'd take out their umbrellas and they would swing it. And so they kind of became this, we are going to use our brand of violence, if you will, mild, but we're going to resist. And my mommy, who's a tall woman, said I soon started standing behind them because I felt, why should they alone do this for us? So there's violence, and there is, has always been resistance, and the issue is, what are we paying attention to? So I'll stop right there with that answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Vandana, for speaking incessantly for 1 hour, 20 minutes or so. I will just add to Vandana, saying that, Aniket, what happens in Wife's Letter, which is a famous story by Tagore, Rabindranath, in the sense that there was no violence on Mrinal, the wife, and there was violence on Bindu, who was much marginalized compared to Mrinal. But still Mrinal left and saying that, I'm not going to allow myself to listen to you anymore. And then she wrote the letter, and the letter says in the end that I am your slave and behind your feet. Chorun tolus chinno. That means I am out now from your protection, as well as the kind of dominance you imposed on me. So, and Tagore has lots of things which Satyajit Ray, along with Rabindranath, has shown us. For example, the movie of Mahanagar reminded me of Vandana's last example, people working in post office. Tagore showed, Satyajit Ray showed actually in Mahanagar that it was Anglo-Indian women and the Bengali women, they became together against the employer. So, violence is not just physical or what you can see positivistically. Violence is if a husband thinks that the wife should not go out in the sun, that's why wife should not go out. So that's a violence, mental violence, cruelty. In our 2005 Domestic Violence Act, mental violence constitutes a huge one. And I think the surveys, all surveys in the world said 7 out of 10 women actually are subject to mental violence in globally. And India, it is about 8 or 9 varying years. That is mental violence. But in India, there is a repressive society. There is a culture of silence still dominates when we talk about our intimate relations, etc. But that's another issue. But what I will thank Vandana for igniting some of the things which I think we can discuss next Monday, same time, in the same platform. And I will have a question which I should want to give a hint to Vandana, that what Vandana said about all this, how do we get this knowledge? Do we actually get the knowledge by reading books, or do we get the knowledge in terms of establishing a structure and follow a process where we'll be discussing all sort of gender issues? I don't say women, because if we don't read gender, we cannot actually have a fuller picture. That is why even in International Sociological Association, we have renamed our research committee, which used to be Women and Society. Now it is Gender, Women and Society. It shows that we want to cover all of us. So how do we get this knowledge, and does knowledge hierarchies become a problem issue? Because Vandana has talked about the so-called developed world and not also that much. Now we call them Global South. Previously we used to call them First and Third World. So I gave a good hint to Vandana. I'm sure she knows that he will actually brief us on this. And then we will have, actually I want to say this clearly, that we will have a different kind of mode, that Vandana will talk less, like 15 to 20 minutes. And 3 of us will be having Vandana Purokasto asking questions, and until she satisfies us, we don't allow her to leave. She can leave, but she won't leave that way. She is not going to flee or run away. So we will have a sort of a very interesting, active sort of, where we will have 2 other feminist sociologists, quite well known to you. I want to keep the secret, so that's why I'm not telling the names. And we hope to see you, the audience which was there today, about 100 all the time. We will have much more encouragement. But now in the last hour, one of our students has asked a question. Virtual spaces increasingly become violent and sexist if we observe the dating apps. Thank you, Thank you, Vandanadi, for an interesting app. But she might be giving you sort of a clue that, getting from the mental violence, that virtual space is not actually less violent, though it is virtual. I will agree, but I'll just say that Vandana say one sentence on this, because we can pick it up next week. Do you want to say one sentence on this, the virtual space?
Actually, the answer is yes, but this is a more complicated question, so maybe I can take up a little of it from September 13th.
So
unfortunately for my life, I have a meeting coming up in 15 minutes, so I have to excuse myself.
Because this is
a
9
different
o'clock,
global
right?
encounter. So
9 a.m. in Connecticut, right? So
it's 9 a.m. in Massachusetts. I'm actually at home. It's a holiday for us today. It's Labor Day for us.
5th of September, Labor Day. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but I have colleagues from Sweden and England that
we will
have a
let you
meeting
go.
with.
Just the formality of vote of thanks. He's not here. After all, he's Vice Chancellor. Let me thank our current Vice Chancellor, my friend, Professor Dubojyoti Chattopadhyay, for being very supportive of this kind of endeavors. Then I thank Professor Ranjan Thakur, our first Vice Chancellor, under whom I was appointed, and I worked with him for a 20-year period. And we became like always talking, arguing, etc. And never actually being enemies, but always disagreeing on some issues or the other, especially. but became always friends. So he takes the trouble of coming to all what sociology does, and very interested actually. And he had lots of exposure because he was vice chancellor of lots of universities as founding vice chancellor, and also pro-vice chancellor in Jadavpur University at sociology. And the audience, wonderful, thank you very much, and showing this much of concern about gender. We hope that we keep alive this one. We will have 7 to 8 lectures from different, not always on gender, but other thrust areas also. So we will say this is motivating for SNU, that you are still very at infancy, and all the big shots, I could see lots of names who came. So thank you very much, dear colleagues. And finally, Bandana. I generally don't want to thank Bandana from my part, but I'm thanking Bandana on behalf of Sister Nivedita University for taking this trouble from 7:30 in the morning. That means getting up at 6 o'clock. So thank you, Bandana, and you have to have this torture also, if it is, torture and pleasure combined, pain and pleasure, and next week the same time. So thank you very much, Bandana, and goodbye to all of you, and we love to see you again Monday the 13th. Don't come because it is 13th. Please do come because it is 13th. So we make it a duo, and second aspect of Bandana's lecture and our actually in sort of interference to Bandana, and try to get some of more interesting and more challenging answers. Okay, thank you all. We still have chat left. A lot of people are delayed thank you. This is a late one. She has left. Anushwa. How and why the construction of gender is still reinforced through everyday language. Oh my God.
Bula ma'am, have you finished? Do you want me to end it?
There is a question in the chat box, but Bandana has left. I think keep the question for next week, because it would be only proper to be answered by Bandana. So keep the question copied in your so that you can ask Bandana again.
Doctor, please copy the question.
Yeah, please copy the question, Shamdatta, because I don't think I should answer this question at all. I could have, but I don't think I should answer.
I copied.
Yeah,
I already
please,
copied.
so that we can finish it actually. And I haven't thanked Madam Ina Bose, which I will do after the second meeting, because it would have not been possible without her support and generosity. But I have kept that thank you, a special thank you for the second day. I hope, Madam Ina Bose, you are not mad with me, because I didn't thank you today.
I will not ask for a thank you, Bula ma'am.
Okay. I know that. That's why I kept it specially for next week, so that it sounds really special, because you are the one without which we could not have done it. Okay, Shomdatta, have you copied it? All of you can leave.
Yeah, I copied, ma'am.
I'm ending the session because we are still going live on YouTube, so I'm ending the session.
Acha, YouTube means, Ina, do you have the...
I've sent you the link.
Okay, fine. In the chat box?